after that one, 221.
Or like the ones that fall on
Good evening, all. Welcome. This is the start of our Spring 2018 lecture series. Unfortunately, Dean Carbolini can't be here tonight. She's out in Old Westbury handling some master planning committee meeting, so she sends her warm regards to all of us. My name is Robert Cody. I'm the Associate Dean of Academics here at the School of Architecture and Design. Before I introduce our exhibition and exhibit coordinator, Naomi Frangos, who will talk about the lecture series and introduce our guest, I wanted to talk about a couple of things. First is about our workshops. One is in conjunction with the symposium and exhibition Stereotomy 2.0 with our visiting professor Giuseppe Caracalla, who's here on loan from the Politecnico di Bari. And that workshop will take place in Old Westbury between April 16th and 19th, so I hope you can join in on that. I think it'll be a fun event. We'll learn a lot, and Giuseppe is a fantastic visiting professor, and it'll be an interesting thing. Look for more information to follow, and look for the posters. They'll be up pretty soon. And then Professor Farzana Gandhi and myself will be doing a workshop over spring break in Puerto Rico to try to help a little bit about what's going on there and trying to develop some kinds of prototypes dealing with storm surge events and other things. So I hope you can join in on that. We have a group of students already that would like to participate, so contact her or myself about that. And then lastly is about summer abroad programs. I know a lot of you have seen the posters and other things up. We have 2 programs this year, one in Spain and one to Italy. And deposits are due to secure space this week, or next week I should say. And so if you have any interest or would like any more information or know somebody else who would want to join in on those programs, please contact me or Professor Diamond or Giovanni. All right, so we can try to make sure that those programs happen as they have for many, many years. And so now I'd like to introduce Naomi Frangos, who will tell us about and announce our lecture series and our special guest here tonight.
Thank you, Rob. Good evening, everyone. I'm Associate Professor Naomi Frangos, co-coordinator of lectures and exhibitions, and I would like to thank you all for joining us tonight. I'd also like to thank Dean Carbolini and the entire SOAD faculty for their support and contribution to our lecture series, and Marcella, Paola, Stacy, Lisa, and Joelle for their joint efforts in organizing these events. Well, this evening, it's with great pleasure that I introduce our 2018 Spring Lecture Series as a themed focus format entitled Scalable Digital Processes and featuring 5 events. Speaking tonight is Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa, Architect and Associate Adjunct Professor at Cooper Union. February 21st is Carlo Ratti, founder of Ratti Associati and Director of Sensible City Laboratory at MIT. March 7th, you'll hear from Hernan Diaz-Alonso, founder principal of Zefiro and Dean at SciArc. April 4th will be Fabio Gramazio, partner at Gramazio Colera at ETH. And April 20th, we have our symposium Stereotomy 2.0 and Digital Construction Tools led by Giuseppe Fallicara, our associate professor who's a visiting professor here at NYIT, but is also a professor at Polytechnic of Bari. He will be presenting on a panel with Christian Pongratz, interim dean of School of Interdisciplinary Studies at NYIT, Shajay Bhushan at Zaha Hadid Code, Eduardo Tibuzzi at PART AKT2, Maurizio Barberio and Michaela Colella from New Fundamental Research Group, Dustin White, our own Director of Digital Technologies and Fabrication here at NYIT, and Bruno Combrunot, Director of the Institute for Research and Training in Stone Professions for the Compagnon du Devoir, with an exhibition to follow at Par Excellence. This series brings together various current leading voices in digital processes as a way to extend and integrate the discussion around the topic throughout the semester. Today's common placement of digital technologies can be found in its attempt to categorize its use in terms of a particular practice, its outcomes as formal attributes, or its aesthetics as trends derived from its applications. What seems to be less critically addressed are questions concerning the role of digital technologies in the how aspect from live data including human input or assessment. Scalable digital processes is structured around the integration of three concepts that aim to augment the architectural discourse around the topic of digital technologies beyond any singular definition of its term. One, the synthesis of work across scales rather than an isolation of disciplines. Two, the ability of digital platforms to perform as generative instrumentalities rather than applied tools. And three, the methods or approaches that dictate various processes. Tonight's speaker, Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa, an experimental architect, urbanist, researcher, and teacher with focus on the emerging architecture of information, is exemplary as one who addresses these issues in his work. His work crosses design boundaries through interpretations not from one object to the next, but within a fluid approach and understanding of interface and information. At the Cooper Union in New York City, he coordinates the master's program Advanced Studio, FS. He does research on computation and is the director of a digital representation and fabrication program, CE. He is a Fulbright and National Endowment for an Arts Scholar and holds an MArch II from Princeton University and a Diploma Architect from the University of Buenos Aires. A prolific writer, his work has been widely published in many media, among others the New York Times, Clarin, La Nación Constructs at Yale, and Pidgin at Princeton, and Plot. He exhibited his work in several institutions and museums, such as the Venice Biennale, multiple times, and the MoMA. In the past, he has been appointed visiting professor at UPenn, Columbia University, UIC Barcelona, Sapienza Rome, De Tella Buenos Aires, and has lectured globally at many universities. He's edited and authored many books and articles, among others. He authored Installazione Peter Eisenman and co-edited Architecture Information, published by Routledge, which is on sale after the lecture. Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa is the design principal of a practice in dual cities in New York and Buenos Aires, Eiroa Architects, NYIT. Tonight he will speak on his latter book, Architecture Information. So please kindly turn off your mobile devices and please welcome Pablo Lorenzo-Eiroa.
Hello. Thanks, Naomi, for a nice introduction. Tonight, I'm going to speak a little bit less formally in relationship to how I usually give a lecture. I think that the point of lecturing in these events is to show you a little bit the big ideas, and then if you're interested in certain aspects, you can go and see what is the work that is published, that there is a lot. So I want to start by giving a little bit of context of what's going on relative to information technologies and its weird and anticipated relationship with architecture. I think that, and I have a lot of text in the slides, the point is to help you more than me understand a little bit, perhaps because of my accent and the kind of like the depth of the ideas, so that you have a certain guide in the background. I think, I'm not going to read all of the points, but just for you to know, and I think that you might agree or disagree, but who knows, but I think that we may share a certain agreement of what's going on relative to design. I think there's a lot of design today and very little critical thinking. There are many solutions, but not the right questions, so I'm more interested in the possibilities of new questions in terms of information technologies and its relationship to architecture. Google and Facebook, as you may well know, they're doing more urbanism and architecture than any architect would dream of. And I think that architecture in that sense is a little bit far lagging behind. In terms of representation, there is something that I usually like to point out. The political aspect of representation, especially of digital representation, that I think is not being used or is not being somehow addressed within the right terms and conditions in the School of Architecture, especially in the US. I think that the political dimension of representation is that whenever we have a new technology, technologies are somehow producing new paradigms or new cultural questions, and I think in that dialogue, architecture is doing very little. I think that we are entering a more critical time in terms of capitalism, and in that sense, I'm interested in reconstructing or integrating a more critical relationship between architecture and capitalism in terms of the division of labor. In that sense, I would like to claim a certain integration through authorship relative to the conditions that usually prescribe architecture. And lastly, there is a lot of discussion, and I really don't know why, in the schools of architecture in terms of the dichotomy between discipline and practice. I don't see that difference. I think that either you're a good architect or you're not. Or a data-driven analytical project, and on the other hand, design. And I think that we have to find more interesting ways of understanding a closer relationship between analysis, survey, and design. So for this, for what I call the post-digital, I think I have to make a disclosure. I've been trying to organize a critical discourse on the digital since 2004, and in 2010 we did an Acadia conference at the Cooper Union and Pratt, in which we started being a little bit more conscious and a little bit more critical of how architecture schools and architects were using the newest technologies and the newest interfaces of software. And I think that finally today there is a little bit of a boredom with the digital, which is activating a post-digital. And I would like to claim that I have a different definition for the post-digital that I'm more interested in, which is, I don't think the digital is here to live. I think it's here to stay. I'm less interested in the digital. I'm more interested in computation and information. And I think that the definition I would like to give has to do with claiming a higher level of authorship. I think that we are seeing a lot of copy-paste and random algorithmic thinking in terms of how students and architects develop their drawings, and there is very little thinking in terms of what's happening behind at the coding level and what's happening with the interfaces. So in that sense, I'm going to try to take you through these 9 points: mapping, code, typology, topology, formal autonomy, technology as a culture, transdisciplinarity, aesthetic problems, medium, and media. And to each of these points, I have some comments and some critical, I'm trying to organize a critical discourse about it, which has to do with a little bit of this sequence. Obviously, it's not a linear sequence, and it's not like a recipe to do things. It's just problems that are going on today and a critical position in relationship to those problems. I think that the most important thing to me in the architecture of information and the urbanism of information is what do we do with data. So in that sense, I think that there is, if you want, a new kind of design paradigm that starts when you survey anything or any territory in which you're going to be working on. So in that sense, mapping and survey are coming back. I think that architects that we are perhaps been doing architecture for a while, we know about the post-structuralist theory of mapping, for instance, the work of Enrique Miralles and so on. That kind of logic has not really entered into the digital. And I am trying to work through survey and data gathering as a kind of like initiation for design principles. So in that sense, we're going to see a little bit of that. We're going to see a little bit of codes, right? We're going to see the different relation between typology and topology, and so on. So to give you, so in all of these points, the idea is to claim a higher level or a higher degree of authorship and a higher degree of signification. For instance, and also to claim a little bit more of a critical position in terms of parametric design, which, for instance, Patrick Schumacher calls parametricism, which is in line with the way Philip Johnson had, if you want, to me, displaced the modern movement to modernism in a very non-critical way. When he did the exhibition about the modern movement, claimed as modernism, modern style, at the MoMA in the beginning of the 20th century. So claiming that kind of relationship and that criticality, I think that the same way we need to understand the new structuralism that the digital is imposing into architecture and see how we can claim different degrees of authorship. For that, I'm going to show you some very clear examples of what I mean through deep structure. This is a painting by Lorenzetti that you probably well known. Erwin Panofsky wrote extensively about it. And to me what's interesting is that the vanishing point, right, that is there in the center, not only symbolizes the relation between Mary and the angel, but it's also the absence of presence of the system of representation. In other words, if you take out the system of representation from this painting, the painting doesn't make any sense. And I think that in that sense, we haven't been using the digital or computation at that level. In other words, we're not really coordinating at the same level the interface and the coding that we are working with in relationship to the message or the conditions of origination that we're working with. I think usually the technology and the techniques are predetermined, they come before the project and they are not circumscribed or constructed through the project. Brunelleschi had to develop a very specific technique on perspective in order to organize his architecture. And we haven't seen much of that today. In other words, new technologies impose new cultural paradigms to architecture specifically, and the architects are not really doing much in that transfer of knowledge. So in that sense, I feel that my work is not related to abstraction, but is related more to concrete art, thinking in the sense that how new technologies can, in a way, produce new cultural discourses. And instead of like me waiting for a developer to give me the technology and me understanding the ranges of the possibilities of that technology relative to culture, I'm much more interested in creating those technologies, creating those medias, creating those mediums, and claim a higher degree of authorship to be able to address new cultural paradigms. So how do we do that with mapping and survey? You all know this is a very interesting floor plan, canonical, of course, I mean after the 20th century by Borromini. And the entire discussion in historians is whether it is two circles, an oval, perhaps a version of an ellipse, and so on. And I think that the interesting point is today with the data and information technologies is actually to go the other way around. This is a project by a student trying to build the ranges of possibilities of that building. And so for instance, this is a work by a professor in Italy, in Roma 3, that he did the first 3D scanning of the church, trying to understand the relationship between the ideal plan and actually what was built in the dome. And to me that produces a very different kind of relationship between history theory and the construction of an intellectual object, in the sense that you have a different way of understanding ideal thinking and planning in relationship to the actual physicality of the object, which sets up today, in the future, a different theory of the object in the past. So what I'm trying to do here is, I'm working also with other architects on Carlo Rainaldi's Santa Maria in Campitelli, and we're trying to develop a survey mechanisms also with a professor in Sapienza University and in UPenn, Andrew Saunders, in which we took a 3D scanner and we did some 3D scanning of these Baroque churches. And the point is, which is work in process, right? to try to understand the relationship between what we think is going on in the building and actually what's going on in the building. And these are different drawings and different analyses. And I'm also working on the relationship between Palladio, Borromini, and Rinaldi, trying to understand, because I think that there is something going on in this church relative to Borromini and relative to San Carlo, trying to understand the relation between the first space and the second space and the two sections, the short section and the long section. So, and this is an image of the actual church. So, in the architecture of the, after the Renaissance, or the architecture of the pre-Baroque or Mannerism, there were a lot of artists and architects that they were very aware of the kind of structuralism or the structure in advance of the project, or the structure before the project, and what was the kind of totalitarian, or if you want, top-down structure of the systems of representation relative to the work of art. So in other words, for Velázquez, perspective was more than a system of representation. It was something that was before the content. And what he did here was to place himself inside the painting. And what I am interested in is that he's displacing the system of representation in order to address not only a contradiction, but also a political problem in representation relative to the kind of content that he's trying to activate, which is the Meninas, power of the king and the queen, and so on. To me, what's interesting about this topology, and even when you are in the Prado in front of this painting, you become part of the painting, so it's really performative. This painting is also close to Tintoretto's Lavatorio, right? Which is also interesting because it also activates a relationship with the viewer. But mainly what I'm interested in terms of computation is a little bit what Palladio did with perspective, according to, for instance, Eisenman. Palladio, if you know this building, the building, the system of representation is kind of displaced and put into criticism because he's trying to expand the space backwards, but he's also flattening the space in terms of the facades, right? So again, another means to activate or problematize the system of representation in relationship to the project of architecture. And I think that we're in a moment today that we are not doing any of that. We are not at the level of the Renaissance because we are not developing the systems of representation, and we are not at the level of the Baroque because we are not displacing any system of representation. And I find that problematic. I think that we are relegating authorship, design authorship, to the technologist, right? And that's why, to me, it's so interesting to be a technologist today. So I like thinking that way. And I think that if we don't do that, our project relegates in terms of authorship. And the same happens in terms of typology and topology. Palladio, this is a study that I did on Palazzo Chericati in Vicenza, and I am trying to kind of couple or relate systems of representation with spatial orders. And here what happens, this building is very interesting because it's very flat and long, so it develops a little bit of a new typology in relationship to the 9-square grid. And I wrote about it, you can go and check that article. So basically, we are in a position today in which origination is given to us, right? You open a software, the software has an aesthetic agenda, an ideology, and you do things within that political frame. In that sense, I think that there are several things to question. So for instance, what is an object, how objects are referenced, and the specific relation between reference and origin. So in that sense, let's get to coding. I think that we are very comfortable somehow understanding how coding works and so on, but we haven't been at that level. We haven't, my mouse is not moving there. Well, we haven't been at that level, which is a displacement of the codes through which we are scripting information. So I think that if we don't do that, if we don't displace those codes, if we don't get our hands dirty and operate at the coding level, there's going to be a predetermination that is going to go beyond the project that you're designing. In that sense, there was a very specific project, and here I'm talking about the Cooper Union, where I've been teaching for 14 years, which is the nine-square grid. And what I was interested in coding the nine-square grid project and thinking about a topological nine-square grid. And what does it mean? It means I was trying to have the students work with different organizational principles and see how each of the students would be able to challenge the origination of their own project. In other words, if you start with a grid that has a very clear organization, thinking how parametrically you would come up with a certain solution that would be able to transcend the point of origin. So in other words, developing a grid in itself as a kind of origination of the system in which you're going to be working was in itself a problem. And the students had to figure out how to originate content through a very specific interface coding. In that sense, what I'm trying to do, first, right, as a first step, I'm trying to have the students, and also myself in my office, relate the signification, or the, if you want, the signifier at a digital level in relationship to a certain signification at the level of the project. And what does it mean? In linguistic terms, there were very different definitions about the relation between sign and signifier. And I'm quite comfortable with Derrida's definition that in a way any sign ends up becoming a signifier. It means that it means beyond what it's supposed to mean, right? So in formal terms, that's very important because in any interface, it means that the moment that you enter and you start drawing in any interface, I mean drawing and even coding, you're going to be speaking through a certain pre-given sign, a sign that you're not going to be controlling, and therefore is going to be saying things without you meaning to say things. So in that sense, what we are trying to do, and this is a Photoshop exercise, working with a pixel, is trying to figure out how to activate the relationship between the digital sign and its signification and try to move or displace that meaning in architectural terms. So here is a pixel. A pixel, as you know, has a value and is a kind of a threshold in itself. It has a spatial value. So the idea here was to produce a parametric grid in which that value was put into a dot, right? So the space in between, or the space of the grid became a space in between, and then it falls back and forth, right? And then the architecture of this project is all about motivating different spaces between containment, space in between containments, and contained space, right? So really producing a certain kind of displacement of the territory of space making relative to the form of the interface, right? And this is the result. These are very, exercises, right? This is another nice grid project, and maybe now I'm going to move a little bit faster. And here it has to do with vectorial points, scripting vectorial points. This is a similar one, trying to develop a topological, if you want, a sign in terms of how a column can code different spaces and in between, and so on. This one is particularly interesting because, and I make every student work, it's very hard because every student works with a different interface. So you need to learn how to code and do the project at the same time. And this to me is very important, not to learn the software and then develop the design. I think it's a pedagogical error. I think most of you go to a course, you learn a program, and then you try to go to design and you do the design. I think it's extremely problematic. This is a project with processing, and in processing, if you know, when you open processing, there's no space. The space plot has to be coded. And we were interested in coding the relationship between the nine-square grid and the space of representation as a one-to-one project, meaning pairing the sign, the digital sign, in relationship to the problem of making the nine-square grid. So what we did here was a figure ground problem in relationship to the coding of the interface. So coding the interface meant to produce the nine-square grid. And there are different, each project is dealing with a different interface and so on. This is a topological project in which frame and content are related to each other and so on, right? And this happens also with materiality, right? I like thinking about material computation and go back and forth between one and the other. This is a topology problem, right? A very clear organization and then displaced topologically. And these are these are design 2 exercises, right? This is an interesting topology, I would argue, going from point to line to surface to topology, all into one, and there are 2 houses, one inside the other. So the point to me is to first, in order to address what happened in the Renaissance, right, is at least to pair the interface, the sign, and the form. In other words, to reveal how a form is indexed and to start addressing, disclosing what's going on behind the form and start producing a topological loop between one and the other until you are able to displace origination and also displace the interface through which you are working with. And this is our office work. We started addressing these issues by thinking on parametric surfaces back in the 2000s. And the interesting thing to me was that architects usually were coding surfaces, but we were all thinking about the space plot of representation. And I became progressively interested in trying to decode the relation between the surface that we are coding mathematically and the space of representation that is enabling that coding. So for that, for instance, we did different houses projects that a little bit relate to what I was doing at the Cooper Union. And for instance, in this house, we became interested in the history of how architects work with the Moebius strip, the Klein bottle, and a surface that we started working with, which is rather more complex. And thinking that the Moebius strip really produced a displacement of the ground plane. The Klein bottle started addressing different problems of volumes because it's really more complex and it has another dimension. So I was interested in terms of thinking what is the topology of the Moebius strip and what really displays in architecture. I think the ground, or perhaps the relation between the envelope, interior, exterior, and the Klein bottle that is able to display, for me at least, 2 planes. And so I was interested in developing a surface that would be able to create a truly 3-dimensional diagram. So in that sense, we developed this house that we call House 2B. So programming the surface was equal to programming the background space. So we were trying to address multidimensionality in terms of being able to displace center and periphery, like a nine-square grid problem, corner and center, and the back side and the front side of each of the planes in X, Y, Z. So in that sense, we claim that this surface plays 2 roles. It integrates center and periphery with corner and center spaces, and it does that in 3 different folds and in 3 different axes. So you really have a center of a space becoming the corner on the other and so on. It's a very complex kind of surface. And we were trying to do the Cartesian version of that, which then I'm going to explain in a project that spin out from that one. So what we were really after was to produce a topological displacement that would be able to transcend the origination of the Cartesian XYZ planes, right? So we did this house, right? There are different diagrams. That's a Cartesian version, that's a topological version, and then the house is trying to deal with the 2. And these are some images of that, right? Inside, and so on. And we were trying to claim that at a certain point, there has to be a certain formal autonomy in what you do. In other words, like we work with reversible systems but we are also very aware that reversible systems are problematic. So we're trying to work with a certain notion of a non-reversible object, like arriving to a moment in which you say, okay, this is a moment of signification in the project, and perhaps it can transcend its own parametric logic. And we took that project further for the Guggenheim Museum, and we were able to find that the two surfaces, the Cartesian version and the topological version, they can be intertwined within each other. And we were able to develop two circulation systems, one for the temporary exhibition and the other one for the permanent exhibition, and do a one continuous loop with two of those Cartesian systems replicated. Those are the images of the museum. But then we figured out that why don't we play with the logic of the two systems, with the Cartesian system and the topological system. And what we did was to integrate one within the other, and we created the two versions, one looping within the other, and thinking that the architecture was a little bit contained as an object, as a sculptural object, showing art within a space environment. So we were very interested in that critical relationship between architecture, a little bit like a sculptural figure containing art, and thinking that the ultimate container was a little bit like a space environment. And these are the images of that museum. More recently, like about 4 years ago, we started working on the Cartesian version of that topology, and we developed this house that is a little bit more professional, if you want, but not less interesting. We developed a crowdfunding mechanism and to fund this house, and we developed a house that is actually 3 houses within one, following the same logic of the first diagram, X, Y, and Z. These are the tower, the L shape, right? Different typologies being made out of defining the Cartesian order. And we started to think that perhaps we were laying out the main parameters in order for those parameters to become displaced. This is the first phase, so it's the typology, right? It's a very clear typology. But then what we are interested in now is taking that typology become a topology. So therefore, interior, exterior, and ramp start looping into one another and taking it back from the corner to the center to the periphery. And this is, these are it's a little bit like a work in progress, a more professional version of that idea, right? And these are the images. So how do we define technology as culture, and thinking about fabrication and thinking about interfaces and so on? I think that it is quite clear, at least today, that architecture has relegated its cultural project to technology, and that is losing that race in a way, right? I think that, for instance, I became very interested in expanding the relation between drawing and building, thinking that technologies define cultural programs, and that technologies in a way started modifying reality much faster than what architecture did. And here, of course, we have an evolution of the relation between technology and architectural design. We have been working with surfaces, we have been working with parametric systems, and I think today the challenge, of course, is big data. The challenge is about survey, it's about measuring a territory, and there are different devices and different conditions that we are all using. Of course, this is applied also to material logic, right? And these are experiments that we did in Buenos Aires using very low technologies and very low resources, but thinking in terms of parameters, line parameters, and how you displace a line as a parameter, and so on. And then thinking in terms of digital fabrication and the problem of the typification of the kind of solutions that we're all doing, right? These are parametric surfaces being built with the CNC and so on. So that took me to a much more interesting area of research, which is, and it became a little bit like an economic problem, an economic factor, and also a capitalist problem, in the sense that it was much longer to ask for a grant or to ask for the money to be able to buy the newest technology than having the students build their own tools. So in that sense, I became much more interested in thinking the relationship between drawing, coding, and parameters in terms of starting to displace each of the conditions that in a way, determine the design. So for instance, the Rhino cam, we all take as a given, but we don't do much with it. And we started addressing that. We started addressing the way that we draw. We started developing machines with physical computation and, of course, Arduino and the typical interfaces, and thinking that we can draw differently, or that we can code differently in relationship to the machines that we are using. We develop also CNC machines. We develop sometimes 3D printing technologies, but also thinking that the material, usually in digital fabrication, the biggest problem that I have is that the material is inert. The material forces are not active. That's why I'm also interested in material computation. So what we did was to try to figure out a reciprocal, more active relationship between the machine that is imprinting a drawing and how that drawing becomes of a different kind once it is physically actualized. And I don't use the word translation because I think it's very problematic. I like to think about concrete art. And for instance, this is a minimal surface that emerges out of the pressure of drawing or scoring a square into an aluminum sheet with a CNC. So we use that as a parameter of design. We use the resistance of the material to start coding and addressing the forces that became active in the metal sheet. So therefore the project became about drawing, scoring, and deforming the material as a unique sort of material and coding process. We continue doing that also with 3D scanning. We did an exercise in Barcelona, 3D scanning Sagrada Familia, and trying to address the relationship between the way the scan worked with a point of origin and an array, a perspectival array, and try to take that back into the metal sheet as a little bit of an imprint, a back imprint of the laser scanning the project. So we had a different version of that, of Sagrada Familia flattened out. So in that sense, what I call concrete art is related to a question of being. I think that when we use digital technologies, we are displaced in terms of being, and we are not able to construct signification beyond the parameters that produce the design. So in that sense, I'm very comfortable with Badiou's definition of being, and I try to work that way. I try to think that the form has to acquire certain signification beyond the system of representation, or at least address the system of representation. We're working on a 3D printing machine to print this chair for the Veni Biennale. That is going to be an exhibit now in this coming Veni Biennale. And we're working also with a company in Japan programming the polymer so that it would react to a certain temperature once you sit in the chair. And this is all research in progress. So what the idea is that I'm trying to no longer use a machine to build a project independent from the project that I'm designing. In other words, I'm trying to develop site-specific machines and project-specific machines. So in other words, this chair is going to have a unique 3D printing machine that we are building piece by piece, ordering the pieces in China with my assistants, Gabriel and Yaoi and Pablo. And we are also working with a Spanish architect that he's very good at materiality, Nelson. And we're trying to put all these things together and do a very specific kind of project in which the machine is as important as the object. And I'm showing you a very dark image because I have a legal problem, so we cannot really show the design because we didn't patent it yet, but I can show it to you if you're interested later. We are also looking for investors for the Veni Biennale because Actually, it's not that expensive. The machine is $3,000 only, but all the mechanism and the research cost money, of course. Now I want to make a little bit of a transition in terms of architectural history and what happened between the 90s and the present time, relative to all these problems and thinking about the relation between the ground, the object, and the environment. We did this project back in 2002, in which we were really trying to code the facade, bringing all the field conditions back to the object, and we did that tower. Then we also worked with projects that they tried to articulate a certain relationship with the ground, as many architects did. We did projects that were carving the ground, literally, right? And so on. But the question in this displacement between ground, object, is what happens at the level of the landscape, and what happened in the 1990s relative to the landscape, and what's happening today, and today in relationship to nature. We did a park back in 1999 to 2002 in which we were able to design the shoreline in dealing with environmental forces. And that set up a very different question to us in terms of what architecture is and what design is. And that I think is opening up a very interesting transdisciplinary discourse to this, which is what happened when you design the environment, or what happens when in the Anthropocene, which is the fact that the man has already set up a different relationship with the environment, and how do you intervene as an architect when you know that your intervention is going to affect the environment. This is Buenos Aires, and this is the La Plata River. Is literally a fluid ground, like meaning there's so much sediment in the water that you can think that it's a different kind of territory. So what we did, I was just a graduated architect, we started thinking that we could design with those forces, and also we did the typical design in relationship to an umbrella structure by Amancio Williams that we were able to get the money to rebuild. So we developed a landscape which was a wavy landscape. We designed technically how the blocks were like following the landscape. So to imitate a little bit Amancio Williams' movement in the ground in relationship to the structure and also the shadows and so on. That's how the water accumulates and so on. That's us over the umbrella structures. Claudio Beckstein was able to direct the work to reveal that umbrella structure. So there was a very interesting relation between the ground and that structure, as I was saying. But the idea was this, was to have the shoreline become not really designed a priori, but the shoreline is a work in progress that we were able to do by selecting the landfill. Like in other words, we were like programming the form of the shore in relationship to the dominant currents and the wind and the kind of landfill that we were adding. We then did an experimental project with this, thinking that if the Rio de la Plata is so shallow, you could actually apply that logic and develop parks all the way to Colonia, thinking that the bridges to connect the two cities could also be somehow developed through a sedimentation process. So in this relationship between architecture and the environment, I think that what happens is that the architecture always thought as the environment as the other, right? As displaced territoriality. And I think that in that sense, what we're trying to do is to think that reality is not inert, and thinking that we can inform environments. And maybe I'm going to go through this later. And I think that one of the interesting things, and now I want to start addressing big data, because obviously when you work with environmental conditions, you are addressing big data. I think that the current problem with big data is the theory and data balance. Like in other words, architects who have been working with theory of architecture, theory of history, and so on. And now with big data, we are with a completely different paradigm, because we are working with so much information that really the theory that we have in advance doesn't really matter. It matters how you're able to read the amount of data that you're working with. So in that sense, forensic architecture and survey as design are the new modes that we're trying to address. And obviously you have the zoning code, which is really old and pyramid, that doesn't work anymore. So we're trying to address the relation between coding, architecture, and coding the environment as a one single thing. And these are codes that my students did, a very simple programming language, is C and HTML, thinking that you can recode the grid of New York and pair how you're coding the sediments, how you're loading information in terms of the sediments, and seeing a different relation between the grid and the river. So for instance, that's Roosevelt Island, and those are floating sediments that are programmed to be attached to the grid. And these are other examples of how to deal with that. We're also looking at geology, thinking what's below ground. Obviously in New York there is a reciprocity between the skyline and what's below ground, but they inform each other. But it could be much more specific today relative to how we understand the environment. So we develop a recoding of the different ground densities to rethink where should be built according to economic values, for instance, because it's cheaper to build what is the rock is closer to the grade level, right? So we're trying to think of a recoding of New York in relationship to that. And this project, for instance, is trying to deal with flooding by letting the water come in and distributing the water in the interior courtyards of the blocks, thinking of a topological relation between predeterminated systems such as the grid and an emergent system such as the environment, and thinking of a parallel city. In terms of aesthetics, I think that we are dealing with a completely different paradigm today in terms of how we model architecture, because we are thinking about an expanded architecture of a space environment. These are all fluid dynamic simulation of the heat island effect of Manhattan. These are a cloud of heat island effect over the buildings of New York City. And the student did a very specific and precise work on trying to figure out the void and the height of the tower and the south-facing face and the materiality and how much solar gain and solar heat was gaining, and trying to model the temperature skyline of New York, right? So that was for us the new kind of New York. What is the New York that you don't see that is there, right? Well, it's the temperature heat island effect that you can feel but that you don't see, right? So we were like developing different mapping strategies, and again, mapping becomes actually almost as important as design. And then the design solution is about of how well you understand the information that you're dealing with. And so this student created corridors to try to magnify the effect, the cooling effect of the green parks in relationship to little squares, and try to create wind corridors. And another student did a parallel study with wind to try to open up and lower the heat island effect in relationship to the accumulation of different parks, right? And these are all the simulations. So you see, we are more in this paradigm today, right? In a defiguration of the object in relationship to the environment and a topological loop between the building and the environment. We also did a project with sound. This is a sound mapping of New York. The student was interested in mapping sound conditions in different typologies in the city, right? Different public typologies of places. And he was able to open up, access, gather its own information, because he was able to open up available devices. Obviously, you go to certain websites and people are willing to share and open the mics and open the cameras and share their information real time. So he was able to gather all that data and do very precise simulations of the sound out of opening up mics in cell phones. And then he was trying to recode the streets and the spaces in relationship to that information. And he developed a sound landscape of New York and his solution to New York, right, the two. That's the actual condition, and that's what he was proposing out of deviating sound conditions in New York. Relative to the medium, I think the medium is also important, and also we should be developing new mediums. We have been recently more interested in the urbanism of information, and these are students that, for instance, they are working in this case with shared driving, Uber, right? And this student developed a very particular form of algorithm that would enable us to use the city very differently, because if you can optimize the sharing of the ride in relationship to the loops that all the Ubers are doing in terms of waiting for clients to take them somewhere, if you can optimize all that, you can develop a very interesting different form of urbanism, because you can expand the walkable areas and you can optimize the loops so that cars would not enter into the areas where they're close to parks, and you can start developing a very different way of organizing sharing cars as a system of transportation. We also did a very radical different example in the same studio, which was to think about Instagram as the Noli Piranesi dialect. And this student was able to retrieve different Instagram images of a certain monument. You know, Instagram is kind of like the city of tourists in Rome, for instance. This is Rome. What I asked the student to do was to build up a point cloud through photogrammetry out of the different field of Instagram photographs. So, in other words, these are point clouds developed out of a multiplicity of point views from Instagram, right? So in a way, what he was really interested in was to depict the Rome of Instagram, right? What is the Rome of Instagram? What's really going on? And how can we actually depict a form that would be indexing real-time how tourists are actually kind of destroying Rome, right? So the idea was in these drawings to develop the city of Rome for the residents as kind of an escape, and the city of Rome, optimize the city of Rome for the tourists so that they don't bother, they go, they take their Instagram shot, and you have like the two kind of parallel cities. And the interesting thing was to look at the in-between. So in terms of media, I think architects, we should also be very suspicious of how we use media. We started very interested in curating our own media. Like we developed architecture information at Cooper and Pratt back in 2010, thinking that the way that you communicate architecture is as important as the architecture that you do. And for that, I want to go into the book that is the subject of this presentation. I mean, in reality, I presented a lot of the work, but in reality, the point is to show, use that work as a representation of the ideas of the book, of course, right? So the book is dealing with all the issues that I presented, authorship, formal autonomy, digital signifiers, data gathering mechanisms. But it's doing it in a critical way, trying to think origination and trying to discuss destination. So thinking that, again, it is important how you originate a project, but it's also important how you communicate that project, because the destination, we all know that Facebook short gaze is actually being the dominant means of communicating architecture, and that's actually very kind of distortive for architecture. So we thought, how can we critically address that relationship? So what we did was to invite different architects that they work at different levels and develop different critical chapters. So we invited architects that work with deep structure, all the way to architects that work with affection, in terms of visual affection more than bodily affection. And thinking about reversibility and non-reversibility. And in between there are different ranges, right? Different ranges of authorship, or different ranges of engaging with computation, different means of representation, materiality as a problem of representation, and so on. So this is the book, this is the list of invited people, there are quite a lot. And as I was saying, Acadia 2010 was very important for us, because we can claim that we were the first architects in digital representation that we tried to organize history theory of technologies relative to computation. And so in that sense, the first chapter, the introductory chapter, is done by people like Mario Carpo, for instance. Before Mario Carpo actually became kind of, now he's the voice of history of technology. Patrick Schumacher, Werner Kasch, Mark Linder, there were a lot of interesting authors that were thinking already about a critical aspect of computation, but they were not really given a place. So we thought, both in terms of the conference, inviting historians and theoreticians, In Acadia, that was not normal at the time. There was like literally a technological conference. And we thought after that conference to do the next step, a much more critical aspect of it. And then we had Chandler and another artist work on relational diagrams in terms of how we thought that there was a critical relation between the different chapters and what was happening in between the chapters through data-driven algorithms. So the book in itself was also part of that curatorship. And you have introductory essays by what then became parametricism, right? This was before that, and so on. Then the second chapter is particularly interesting. So the first chapter is about history theory, and different voices in history theory that are very dissonant. People that they don't agree with each other. And to me that was interesting because we wanted to fight against an ideological book. We did not want to develop an ideology of what we thought people should do with the book. We wanted to create a critical discourse in which you were kind of responsible of positioning yourself in relationship to different voices. The first, in a way, that was the introductory chapter. The second chapter is quite interesting because it's mostly architects that work at deeper levels, that they are not interested in the image of the project, they are not interested in how things look like, but they are interested in systems, mathematics, mapping, and so on. And one of the most interesting, and also I have to mention, for each chapter, the person that is there on top is an interview, then you have the projects, and then we have a closing essay about that chapter. So there is a secondary structure within the overall structure to organize the problems, the questions of the discourse, and a kind of a theoretical conclusion of the discourse. And this is images of the second chapter, which is about deep structure. And we have amazing projects by Laura Kurgan working with Diller-Scofidio. I think Diller-Scofidio, well, now you know what they are doing, but they are architects that they really think critically about media. And Laura Kurgan has a very interesting program at Columbia University about theory and activating problems about mapping. So we have a project that is Exit by Diller-Scofidio that maps different problems of displacement in the world relative to mapping. The third chapter is a chapter that tries to be the architects that they somehow go back and forth between deep structures and structures that have to do with formal structures. And these, the people that are included here, Carl Chu has an introductory essay, which is one question, and Carl Chu just writing about it. And then there are different architects, like Eisenman Architects, Scott Cohen, ourselves, and so on, that they discuss different relationships between form and what I would argue is more of a critical form, because there are structures that they have to do with touching upon two different problems and making a synthesis, like the Galerie Memorial, our project, or Hans Meyer's coding of the columns. The fourth chapter is rather interesting, and it became more interesting after we published the book, which has to do with information materiality. That's the way we call the chapter. And there are all different architects that deal with problems of materialities in very, very different ways. So for instance, the introductory interview with Ciro Nagle, that he thinks that there is a discipline about materiality, so he calls it material discipline. Then there is Nader Terani, that you probably well know, that he works very specifically, especially in his installations, different concepts of materiality as computing forces. Office Da, well, that's another. Then Saturo, Tom Main, Reiser Umemoto, Roland Snooks, and Philip Besley. And closing with a very interesting article by Kim Menges. So for instance, this is Ciro's interview, that he has different systems dealing with different material problems. This is Nader's installations. Well, this one is the other way around, that's Ciro. Nader. And then this is Roland Snook, that's thinking about computation in terms of materiality. And then Akim Menges, that you probably know, that is very interesting what he's doing at the nano level, thinking about the relation between things that you usually do not see that happen in wood, and how to use that as part of the parametrics of computation. And then lastly is in a way, the group that started dealing with the digital, I would argue, in the 1990s, and thinking about the digital as affection. And you have like the people that are more interested in how the things look like and design. And that's also that's it. Yeah, I was going to say, but I think it's too long. Thank you. Sorry, was a little longer. Okay. Thanks for your patience, everyone. I have one.
Thank you so much, Pablo. That was an incredible lecture. I'm just going to start off with a few questions to get the conversation going and then open it up to the students. I would like to contextualize your work a little bit within the scope of our lecture series topic of scalable digital processes. Kim Menges, in his paper from 2006, Simple Systems and Complex Capacities, he states that one possibility of unfolding novel synergies in such extreme conditions is to utilize the capacity of computers in the design process in an alternative way, one that foregrounds, instrumentalizes, and innate capacities of materials manufacturing and construction processes, rather than merely elaborating form in the digital realm, which your work seems to do exactly that. My question is, your work is obviously process-driven, whether you're doing it in the context of the classroom or in individual projects. And the way you've outlined you've categorized your areas of kind of like your different lenses of looking at things in the 9 areas that you outlined in your lecture. And also the way that you've categorized your book into 6 areas that deal with information. I guess the general question would be that because it's all process-based, when you start a project, do you start with thinking through one of these 9 systems, or do you start with thinking one of the categories in the book?
Well, first, the entire idea of both the book and the way that I try to address this critically is that, for instance, Peter Eisenman was the first one to open up the process. Like before Eisenman, architects were not really addressing the process, right, as part of the design. I think Eisenman's revolution was to open up the design. Like you would be able to look at his projects and see, but he's doing this in this step, and you would enter with a critical sense because you would relate to how you would do that and so on, right? So the opening up of the process was, to me, very important. Now, there is also a criticality of that, right? Because once a project is done, it acquires an autonomy beyond the process, right? And that's what I meant when I say, in computation, people that usually work with computation are process-driven architects because they know how to code, they work critically through different interfaces sometimes, right? And so on. But in reality, the first digital architects, they were less, except for Greg Lynn, let's say, they were less concerned about the process and more interested about producing images that they were more spectacular or more difficult to depict how they were not done, right? And to me, that made me think about the relationship between process and non-process. So for instance, now, and it had to do also with the idea of the field. When Stan Allen and so on started talking about the field, that was taking the process to the field, right? To processes that they were open, emergent process, and so on. And I started becoming more interested in what happens after you open up the process, what happens with the object once you close back the process. And it's a double game because you have to think about what's before, but once you finish the project, there's something that is after the project, right? Which is what I call, Eisenman talk about formal autonomy. To me, it's concrete art. and once the project emanates beyond the system of signification that produced after the index, right? And then some people started addressing this idea of the object in what was called then OOO, object-oriented ontology, which I'm very critical of because they took it to an extreme. I started talking about what happened with the object back in 2008, right? And now, the way, you know what I mean? So I think that what's mostly difficult in architecture in general is to have a critical balance, or a more critical synthesis, if you want. I think that there are different, architects tend to become a little bit ideological about what they do, and I'm more interested in finding, at certain moments, specific criteria and specific ideological problems in relation to what's going on. So now, I'm much more interested in the expanding the process as far away as possible in terms of origination, but also dealing with a certain autonomy of once the project is put together, what happens with that new meaning, right? Like the meaning that emanates after the building is done, and even in terms of media, what happens on the other picture plane, right? Like you as an architect, you work through a process, you produce a building, and then people start taking pictures, they start using the building, and then there is the use of the building, and which is forensic architecture, right? What happens after? What happens with media? So I'm very interested in deconstructing back and forth the relation between pre as much as possible and post as much as possible.
Well, it's great that you're bringing up Peter Eisenman, and I know that you worked for him, and we had Peter come and have a discussion with Dean Ferbellini and Chair Matthew Ford, and it was on the topic of mentoring. So it's interesting to hear how that impact, just as a continuity in our lecture series, how that impacted some of your thinking and your association with process in your work. So one thing project that you talked to me about was the project you did with Peter in Italy, where you did these installations, and they were all constructed as some kind of site-specific installations that reframed the way you read the space. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, that was to me was essential in terms of computation, because I started understanding, well, I have to say, even before that, I had the luxury in Princeton University to study with Hal Foster. Hal Foster showed me a different dimension of what deep structure is and what the different methodologies of art are. And then with Eisenman, when we did the installations, for instance, the Castelvecchio was a revealing moment. You know, I think the installation looks good. It's Peter's project. I was an important part of the project, but you know, it was Peter's dialogue with Scarpa. And to me, it was very important the moment that we realized that perhaps we didn't need to do too much to what was there. You know, we didn't need to express Eisenman's diagrams. You know, the idea was an installation of Peter Eisenman in the courtyard of Castelvecchio. Castelvecchio was designed by Carlos Scarpa, right? The moment that we started figuring out, well, but there's something even more interesting going on, because Carlos Scarpa, I don't know if you know the project, he worked there 15 years, and the most interesting thing about Carlos Scarpa's Castelvecchio is that his project was about framing the existing building. It was just lifting things, framing the floor, separating the floor from the wall. So it was all about intervention at the level of the frame with details. So my idea of computation in a way comes like activating the frame. How do we activate the frame in digital design? It came a little bit out of a problem of a context. How you take the context beyond what it is. Like usually you are giving a space in a gallery. It also has to do with all what happened in terms of gallery site-specific interventions in the art, and what Michael Heiser did which is in the Dia Beacon, which is artists were intervening in the gallery critically, right? Then they went outside the gallery because the gallery was a political space. They were all reacting against the gallery. They went outside to do site-specific interventions, and Michael Heiser came back to the gallery with a different accumulation of ideas of the site back to the gallery, and made these voids that are really fantastic because they are like kind of natural but are not natural. So I was interested in that process of how you break the frame, or how you readdress the context in a critical way out of the work of very interesting artists, but also taking that history theory to computation, to thinking how you activate the logic of the project in terms of the frame, and which is the interface, right?
And a lot of your works, we're talking about galleries and installed work, site-specific work, and in your article in Carlo's book, the recent one that he published, Carlo Nage.
Silo. Sinonaje. Okay.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, the material discipline, you mean?
No, the other one from his.
The one about the GSD. It's called.
It's slipping my mind too.
It's by Akhtar. Yeah, I just wrote an article. I don't remember the name of the book.
Well, you wrote on typology.
On typology and topology. Yeah.
And you bring that up in some of your studios, and I feel like a lot of your work. I feel like they're like built drawings. That they're also like drawn out installations. So you're drawing out something to create the installation, whether it's in a virtual realm, a dynamic simulation, or material world, such as the aluminum pieces that you're working with. So do you think that that has any resemblance to any kind of responsive architecture that we're seeing today? For example, Carlo Ratti's going to come and speak to us about that, and he has some of his responsive materials. So do you associate that idea?
That's a really interesting problem, because obviously architecture, is becoming more responsive. But I'm a little critical. You see, I'm maybe in that sense I'm more interested in the history and theory of responsiveness and emergence more than in the digital version of responsiveness. Because I think it's much more interesting what architects like Palladio did, a building that was moving, which was not moving because he couldn't make it moving, but that movement is much more interesting than actually making the building move, you know what I mean? And we're talking with Patrick Schumacher about the way that he's understanding, he understands emergent systems to me in a non-architectural way. He understands them as systems that are emergent, fine, and he tries to make his architecture, and that's very different from Zaha's work, right? He tries to make responsive systems in which he's trying to map in a kind of functionalist way what's going on and make the architecture for that. That's extremely problematic to me. It's a neo-functionalism, which is a little bit what happens in the Le Corbusier chaise longue. You see the Le Corbusier chaise longue is amazing the first minute. 5 minutes is kind of okay. 10 minutes you hate it. Why? Because it's actually trying to mimic you sitting in the chair and being functional about what is supposed to be, you are supposed to be doing in the chair, and trying to make the form index you in the chair. That is extremely problematic in terms of a critical modernism. The post-structuralist, you see, to me there's a problem today, and my entire lecture touch upon the relation between modern movement and post-structuralist theories. And the problem is, to me today, is to make a synthesis, because you can't get away with the modern movement. I mean, they did amazing stuff. The Renaissance did amazing stuff. The Baroque did amazing stuff. Why are we circumscribing ourselves to say we are rewriting everything again, we are using new technology, and the new technology is setting up a discourse, but actually at the cultural level, those new discourses are far delayed in relationship to the Renaissance and the Baroque at the cultural level. So Patrick's error, to me, is that he understands systems very well, he understands emergent systems very well, but he doesn't understand architecture. And to me, the problem is that he's doing a kind of functionalist way of responsiveness. I don't know Carlo Ratti's work so well, but I think that when people do architecture that is responsive, is indexing the response is problematic. It has always been problematic in the history of theory of architecture. And then just to anticipate and to index what's going on in a space is problematic, because it takes away formal autonomy. It takes away the form to be able to inform the space. So I'm interested in the kind of empowerment of form in relationship to function. And I think that when you do responsive architecture, you're in a paradigm that is an old paradigm. It's new because of the technology, but it's old in terms of the theory of architecture. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and his smaller projects like Cloudcast that is doing what you're talking about, where it's taking actual measurement from the environment and using it to design the pavilion or the system. He expands that to his urban analysis, which is something you also showed us of New York. And he tests his data sets through shared networks, and something that I saw that you were testing in your master studio with the Instagramming.
Exactly, but I'm trying to be critical about that.
You are, because
there was
in a way, in the projects that I saw and what you showed today, there was like a feedback loop that allowed you to kind of think of a new urbanism and try to constructively accept the analysis, the data set and the analysis to inform the actual decision making.
But we think that the data gathering is a design. We don't think that we're gathering data directly. We think that it's a process of, it's a cultural understanding of the context. So it's charged already.
Well, it's like you were saying when you introduced your lecture, and you were talking about pedagogy and how we employ in schools these system of teaching digital computation or software separately than the design studio.
Absolutely.
And then it's not integrated.
Exactly.
Right? And so it's similar to what we do a lot when we teach studio is the idea of collecting data and doing data analysis. But that the way you present the data analysis should already be informing your proposed design.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you're just...
It's like Mirage's idea, right?
Right?
You measure the territory, you measure the croissant, right? The typical, right? The famous one. And by measuring the croissant, you're creating something else other than, right?
Yeah, I'm curious. Sorry, I just remember the name of the book, The Generic Sublime.
The generic sublime.
Yeah, right.
It was all about the generic.
It says, yeah.
And the relationship with who has worked. Because he did a study on that.
We're also going to have Fabio Gramazio come in to the other extreme of complete automation with robotics. I'm curious to know what your take is on authorship.
Can I be critical about it? Well, I think that they
come back and have that discussion, but yes.
No, I always said the same on their work, and maybe my work is a reaction to that. You can't have a robot imitating hand, right? It's ridiculous to me. I mean, coming from Latin America, I'm sorry, you know, for us, brick means hand, right? When you see a wall made of bricks, you index the person because it's a hand-placed material, right? When you have a robot imitating the man, to me, I'm a little harsh. I know they did an amazing work. They opened up a lot of problems, but to me, it's an ethical problem. I don't think that you can have a machine imitating a man. Because first of all, it's kind of ridiculous, and it's a little bit off target, because even if the wall, by the way, the curved brick walls, Eladio Dieste is a famous engineer in Latin America, which was a reference. He did it before, and they look the same. Actually, they look better. The Eladio Diestes look better because the hand-placed brick, when you do it with mortar and they all become a double surface, a double colored surface, they work structurally. In Gramazio color, the curved bricks are just placed together, but they're not really working structurally.
I think it would be interesting to do the mapping of the two choreographies, because the choreography of the movement of the body will be a different sort of index than the code that indexes the movement.
But why? The question is why, having such an advanced technology, you're going to replicate human behavior? That's my question. Isn't that, you see, to me, at the level of signification, is an error, because you're not working with the autonomy of physical computation and what it means in terms of the future and the sign, right? The sign that activates in relationship to the old technology of the brick. It's kind of like a, to me, it's a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor because the man is there as a metaphor, and then it's problematic at the level of signification, because I still see the proportion of the brick is because of the hand, right? and the reach, right? And so why would you have a robotic arm? You know, robotic arm is also problematic. Why do you need a robotic arm? I'm trying to completely eliminate the notion of figuration, right, in terms of what we do with computation, because there are different signifiers, right? I don't think that we need to represent what was already represented. So that's my problem. I think that the choreography will be interesting, of course, because you will be indexing what the thing, how the thing is done. But the choreography will be also indexing the original mechanism of production, which is the brick, right? And that I find very problematic. You know, sometimes they did it without the mortar. That means that it doesn't become one single structural element, right? You touch the thing, it falls, right? When they do it with a mortar, then it's kind of different, but still the Eladio Dieste looks better because it's more appropriate with the technology. And the important thing about the Eladio Dieste was that he was doing extremely complex mathematical structural construction with low technology. So if Eladio Dieste wakes up and he sees that, he will think it's anti-ethical. It's anti-ethical because you have to do that in South America to do a radical form, and you have to do it with very low technology. And here you have an ultra high technology from a developed country imitating the form of somebody. You know what I mean? To me, it's problematic, I have to say. I'm sorry, I'm very critical about it.
It's good. I'd like to see if there's any questions in the audience.
Sorry for my English,
No,
but you understand because
yeah, my accent is Argentinian Italian. So.
This is better.
Okay. So I repeat, sorry for my English.
Yeah.
I think that the lecture is very interesting, but very complex in the sense that you explain for me a lot of things in very few time.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very hard to have the possibility to enter in every kind of topic. For me, perhaps for the other, it's simpler. I have some suggestion and some question about your work. That the first suggestion is your work is somehow related to a work of Preston Scott Cohen when he wrote a book, Stereoatomic Permutation, about the possibility of deformation of geometric projective, like Girard Desargues projection, in an anamorphotic way when you present your theorem of the clay bottle in deformation like Cartesian vision. I saw some reference to the work of Preston Scott Cohen in the sense that you are creating something perhaps similar to the past between the Renaissance and the Baroque, when the deformation of the classical form right now with the deformation of the clay bottle in a Cartesian way. Is it some and this is the first question, and how really do you means when you think about the deformation of clay bottle in a Cartesian way? That was not clear for me.
So the first question, I think that Scott, I mean, my work is a little bit critical of that, in the sense that, well, we share a little bit Eisenman, you know, Scott Cohen and Eisenman had a relationship, and I think his work had a relationship. To me, it's not all deformation, my work. I'm not interested in deformation. I'm interested in the way I understand topology. Topology is about you know, a gradual tier without break, right? And if you want to take it to the deformation problem, or Greg Lin, you know, when Greg Lin started dealing with topology in terms of two things becoming one, but one is not the two things together. I understand topology in terms, at least for me, it's not a problem of deformation, it's a problem of criticizing origination. So is whatever you have to do in terms of relative displacement perhaps is a word, it's not really deformation. Displacement is a very specific targeted idea, like Palladio, when Palladio takes the Chiericati Palace, right? It's an ideal form. You can say it's deformation, but it's different, it's displacement, because displacement implies a movement that is kind of like conscious about why that movement is applied. It's not just simply deformation. I think Scott's work is more related to choosing, the systems, that the methodologies that you mentioned that have to do with the geometric distortion. It's a little bit about choosing which one and then applying it. I am more interested in being able to construct a condition that will be able to displace the conditions that you're working with. In that sense, you cannot choose one or the other. The Moebius and the Klein are there as an example, but we're not using them. Those were the historical examples that we think some people work with. What we are interested in is thinking how the center and the periphery become one. You see, Scott doesn't do that. Scott is a deformation, but it's not clear what that deformation is displacing. And that's when history starts coming in. That's what I'm interested in Palladio. Palladio was fantastic because he was anti-perspectival, right? He was saying perspective is fake, it's not real. And he was trying to address an architecture that was trying to activate the fakeness or the distortion of perspective in terms of picture planes, interrupting the perspective cone, right? So I'm more interested in that, and I don't think Scott Cohen does that. I think he does deformations, but it's not clear why the deformation is doing what it's doing. I make sure that the deformation or what I call displacement, topological displacement, will be able to connect critically center and periphery. The drawings, I agree that I went fast because I usually have the same problem, that I'm very kind of ambitious in showing all what I did because I work a lot, and then obviously it's very little time, and then you get lost and you probably have a headache from trying to understand
because every argument is interesting. Yes,
exactly. It is a lecture.
Sure, every argument we can do a symposium.
I completely agree, and hopefully the thing is the reason was to explain everything in relationship to the book. That was like she invited me to curate, so I wanted to make sure that I cover the aspects that got me interested in making the book. But it's true that it's always my problem, that I always put too much in little time. So you're right. And perhaps it's also because of what's going on today. I want to make a going through, and if you focus in one thing, then it's not critical of the context of what's going on today. And I'm interested in building up a theory of what's going on today in general. But I agree. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I have a question. I want to go back when you talk about the displacement of the code. And so I think in a way, especially the first part of the lecture, you started talking, really claim the shift between the coding of the object to the coding of the interface.
Like the two. Yeah.
Right? The two as a kind of opposite.
Not
so,
opposite, but related.
But related,
yeah.
Right? So not sequentially, but the two kind of being on the same plane. So I'm wondering, especially thinking some of the work, also the work related to the students, what is really the level of freedom or authorship in coding the interface?
Freedom, all the freedom they can afford, conceptually. Like for instance,
really like practically also.
Yeah,
For instance, even the I think the project that you showed, the one that you're working for the Venice Biennale, right? The robot, robot that in a way is doing, is developing, the project in a certain way. So I think this goes back to the level of what are the constraints, right? Even in the interface. So I think, in a way, the level of freedom, in a way, I'm wondering about the degree of freedom that is never achievable in a way because
the pedagogy, you mean in the studio?
No, I'm talking about the interface itself, the coding on the interface itself.
Well, we destroy everything, literally, and we do things that are not legal, obviously. Yeah. And I learned how to code since I'm 6 years old, right? So I went through all the coding languages. And the funny thing is that computation didn't change too much. Even artificial intelligence, I mean, everybody's so happy to talk about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, there's no artificial intelligence, it's just an algorithm that searches for algorithmic logic and tries to build up a more robust algorithmic logic. So if you go to C language or C++, right, some students are able to, so for instance, I show projects that they code in C directly, no interface, right, just coding the language. Other students, they take HTML, you know, and they code with C language in HTML or Java, right? They work with Java. So, you know what I mean? There are different degrees according to the capacity of the student. And in each of them, even in the degree of freedom, in each of them, first is much better, the farther you go towards the origin, the better. But in terms of the freedom, I make sure that at least if they are not able to activate a problem in the interface, that at least that they are conscious of what the range of the conditions of the interface are, so that the design is kind of coded at the level of signification of the interface. I don't know if I'm clear.
So in a way, I mean, I think the scaffolding somehow, right, that begin to build through, again,
Exactly.
through the coding itself, in a way that's the agenda somehow,
Exactly.
right? And in a way, what comes out, it's really an output that in a way is part of how the scaffolding is designed.
Exactly, absolutely.
Right.
Because to me, actually today, that's the critical overall theory,
Yeah.
is that today the preconditions are more important than the design. Because we live in a society where people are used to click a button, right, and do things. That's like amusement, right? Like the kids, the 4-year-old to 6-year-old, they think that they are doing something when they press a button, right? They think they're doing something. In reality, it's just amusement. The same is happening to architects. Architects, they are thinking that they are doing something. And they are really, to me, they are doing very little. Even when students, when they copy-paste codes in Grasshopper, right? It's like, it's going to be closed in 5-10 years, and this is something that we discussed with the software developers in Acadia. They are looking into that. Like the same way Monsanto is claiming patent over the seed all over the world, right? In crops, getting a profit from the crop produced. The same is happening with software developers. They are not going to take, like, it's going to be incremental. You know, I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
I think that's an open
It's
question
scary.
in a way.
It's like very
But
scary.
I think that's in a way, you know, when if we talk specifically about software, that's another thing, right? So what is the, you know, from the platform, let's say, that will allow you to level of freedom to code in a certain way to other gives you constraints. So in that realm, in a way, I think, how do you define authorship?
Well, constraint to me is how you break the constraint, because we're all constrained by everything.
Right, exactly.
We are not,
so that was the
niche,
question in a way.
that's
There is
niche.
always constraints that are given by the medium.
Well, that Nietzsche's philosophy is all about liberating yourself from the constraints progressively until you become Supermensch, right? So obviously it's a problem, but I think that's the reality, that we are running algorithms today with Facebook. You are running the algorithm. It's rewiring your neurons, right? So I think that the question is how much are you aware of the conditions of signification that you are running from a design point of view and also from a life point of view. So that's when it becomes political to me. That I think that you need, it's like, you know, obviously the matrix problem, which field you want to, red or blue, right? Are you aware of that you are in a cage? Can you feel the limits of the cage? How far can you go? So authorship in that sense, to me, is how high can you go in terms of claiming your condition in terms of your life. It's also related to how you get a commission, and we are very interested in working in that way. That's why I like working as a developer a little bit, because the house that we are doing in the Hamptons, we gather money with friends, and I'm not interested in having a client knocking the door, because a client, when gives you a project, is already setting up an agenda for you. The building code is already an agenda, right? So we're all the time kind of like, and that's a corporate problem, right? A corporate idea was to take architects away from zoning codes. There's no architects in the government here, right? Like it's like it goes forever, right? to design cities is kind of wrong, but it is right for a developer to design the city, and that's the result that we have now, right? It's a total disaster. It's total capitalist production and speculation. So I'm interested in the systems that are running behind, that are determining what we are doing, and how far can you break those systems.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much. Reception outside.
So if you guys are interested, the books are on sale, they're outside.
Are cheaper than normal.
They're not cheaper than normal. It's discount from Amazon.